Hello everyone, my name is Reese Lindmark and you are listening to The Reese Show. On the show, we're trying to clarify what a good future looks like. I know we're all a bit sad about late-stage capitalism, and we want to transition to something, but we don't really know what's next. So, on the show, we interview experts about what is emerging, this beautiful future vision that we can all lean into. I hope it gives you a sense of purpose and clarity about the future. If you like the show, feel free to do something about it. You can leave us a 5-star review. You can tell your friends. You can name your first child Reese. Whatever makes you happy. And if you really dig it, we have an online school called Root, where we help folks understand these root level systems to find our route forward. We have cohorts of world-class systems thinkers that run every couple of months. So if you're interested in that, check us out at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. Thanks. Today I chat with Benjamin Bratton, who is an interdisciplinary academic at the forefront of how technology is changing society. And he wrote this brilliant book called The Stack and has continued to write good ideas around how COVID is shaping society. And today, the main thing that we chat about is how technology is ahead of our concepts and models of us. The technology has changed us so much that we don't have the correct models to understand what's happening. And we dive deeply into that and his work with the Stack and his work, with this institute in Moscow and also this ideas with COVID and surveillance. But that's the crucial idea here is how, thinking about this as the switch to the information age and the creation of new concepts that we can use to model and understand ourselves. That is the function of today's episode. I hope you enjoy it. Goodbye. Hello, everybody. Today I'm speaking with Benjamin Bratton. Benjamin is really this multidisciplinary type whose work spans philosophy and art and design and computer science. And he does that as both a professor of visual arts and the director for the Center of Design and Geopolitics at the University of California, San Diego. And he's also the director of this really interesting program, the program director of this thing called the Terraforming think tank at the Strelka Institute in Moscow. And he's very famous for writing this book called The Stack. And it's this book that outlines a new geopolitical theory for this age that we're in of global computation. And I'm excited to dive in with Ben on all these topics. So Ben, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I'm excited to explore. So today we're going to chat about, how you understand the world and how that started with the Stack and then switching over to your work at Terraforming these days with Strelka Institute, and then kind of applying that to you had this great essay called 18 Lessons of Quarantine Urbanism about COVID. But before we dive into that, I want to stay kind of high level for a second and help our readers our listeners understand how you view the world. I think you're so interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, and it's really interesting. But what's your goal as you go through the world, and how do you find collaborators and info and stuff? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'm a social theorist. I'm really a writer at the end of the day. But my own background has been extremely interdisciplinary, as you mentioned, but also kind of interinstitutional. Working between industry and academia. I think I was someone, of a generation who saw really early on the ways in which what I call planetary-scale computation was transforming the world, or political systems, economic systems, cultural systems, and indeed philosophical systems in ways that were not being properly accounted for. And so just autobiographically for me, that led to a lot of interest in architecture, but in a kind of strange way, in that architecture provided a sophisticated language of systems and spaces and structures that we could use to sort of analyze, but also think about composing and producing. And my interest in that sort of regard was thinking of, I guess, in this sense, is thinking about planetary scale computation through this sort of lens of architecture, which it led to the development of the book, The Stack on Software and Sovereignty, and the thesis of the stack as a way of thinking about planetary scale computation as what I call an accidental megastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that and I want to actually hone in for a second on that architecture piece, which I think is really interesting. I used to work at the MIT Media Lab, which was part of the architecture school at MIT. It's like, and there's also, pattern languages it's a exciting book, an exciting way of thinking.
Sure,
So
Christopher
tell me more
Alexander.
about, exactly. Tell me more about why you think architecture is a home for some of the like weird interdisciplinary thinker types.
That's a good question. I think because it's first of all because it's a design discipline, and that it is been set up in such a way, particularly within architecture academia. I mean, I think we want to make a distinction here, is that in this regard, in which it's able to take in ideas and discourses really from everywhere, from philosophy, humanities, hard sciences, and kind of actively misuse them and misinterpret them in interesting kinds of ways, and to put them to work, to not just be tools of analysis or tools of taking the world apart and breaking it up into smaller and smaller little pieces. But it's a place in which a lot of those little pieces can be brought back together and reassembled into bigger ideas that you can leverage and use to put one brick on top of another and make something. And I think in certain respects, my work is probably increasingly philosophical in certain respects, but my position in that is that, as opposed to an era where philosophy was coming up with concepts and ideas, and then design and engineering was making things that kind of looked like those ideas or resembled these. Right now, I think in many ways the technology is ahead of our concepts, ahead of the ideas that we have at hand to steer them, and to compose them deliberately, and to really understand what's at stake at a more fundamental level. And so, for someone like me, getting in and getting my hands dirty with the nuts and bolts of it all, is a way in which to steer the theoretical and philosophical project as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that what I'm hearing is that this like architecture as a thing is not just about analysis, which is so much of what scientific and other fields are, and just like also the Western tradition of breaking things down into component parts. But architecture also had this idea of bringing things back together in a holistic sense and seeing, from a systemic lens or whatever, how it combines together. And I think so that makes sense to me. The other thing that makes sense, what I'm hearing you say, is that there's traditionally perhaps philosophy was pre-technology. And now, though, technology is ahead of the concepts we have to understand it. And maybe this was similar in like the Industrial Revolution or something like that, where it's like, oh God, what is this new thing that's occurring? And people had to be like, the philosophers had to understand it. So tell me more. So I think
there was a huge revolution in philosophical thinking at that point in time. Everything from positivism to Marxism, emerges in many ways in relationship to the transformations in the world that are happening through technical systems. And I would argue that even going back to Copernicus and the Copernican turn, this is an instance in which we have, the way I would put it is, what in sort of in the definition of a Copernican turn in this way is, we have technologies that we use based on models of the world. So we have a model of how the world works. We produce technologies that allow us to act upon the world in accordance with the logic of that model. But sometimes those technologies reveal that the world doesn't work the way in which our model, way in which we thought it did. It doesn't work in the way in which the model that brought that technology about would have us thinking. We have to then revise the model based on what the technology has disclosed. And I think for my work, there's a kind of different part of the way in which we think about technology is that not just something with which we make, it is also something with which we think. It's a way of remaking the world, and through remaking the world, it reveals things about the way the world works that require us to to conceptualize and to form and to formalize, and so. And this, in many ways, is sort of the basis of the theoretical project in which I find myself.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. That it's not, and I think that is where you and I are very aligned. It's like, okay, we can think of this as like the tech society loop, where it's like technology changes society, society changes technology, and that we have, our mindsets. Technology is not just a thing that we make, but it changes our models of the world and how we think of things. When you talk about the Copernican turn, was that or tell me a little bit more about that specific? Is that like a term that people use?
Yeah, I mean, Kant spoke of the Copernican Revolution, and sort of formally explained his system of thinking, formalization of system of thinking, as in relationship to the Copernican Revolution. So the idea that philosophy has some relationship to Copernicus, and particularly goes back to the beginnings of modern philosophy. But more recently, Freud talked about the Copernican trauma. But the way in which that we use the term is a bit more specific than all of that. I would define a Copernican turn or Copernican trauma as a priceless accomplishment. And I would define it in this sense, both in terms of that technical system, that technical revelation and disclosure, which I just went through. But in more generally, a Copernican turn is when we have some model of the way the world works, in which we, that is humans, Homo sapiens, or a particular subset of those humans more often, imagine themselves to be the center of that system. And the world is the world has unfolded around it, but usually through some means of technical alienation of our own intuitive understanding of the world, such as a telescope or a microscope or statistics. We realize what is disclosed is we're not the center of that system. We're kind of off to the side. We may be a very interesting and important part of that system, the one part of the system that is capable of sapience, but we're not the center. Our planet is not the center of the solar system. Our sun is not the center of the universe. And these Copernican turns, which in fact show us where we actually are within the big scheme, as I say, are priceless accomplishments. I would say that Darwinian biology is a kind of Copernican turn. Neuroscience, the neuroscientific revolution that shows how thinking is not some virtual process, but is a function of biology, biochemistry itself. AI, I think, has been and will continue to be, as it develops, a kind of Copernican turn that shows that our model of our own intelligence, that is how we think that we think, is not only to a certain extent fictitious, but that it's not normative. It is not the normative center of what intelligence is in the world. And that the more that we understand the way we think in relationship to this broader diversity of intelligence, the more essentially the better we'll know ourselves in this regard. So once more, these Copernican terms is kind of this displacement process over time that are usually technologically mediated. And again, as far as I'm concerned, that's what philosophy is for, and that's what sort of the pursuit of knowing the world is all about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the Copernican turn, I love it as and just the move from the, geocentric model to the heliocentric model. That was just like the simplest form of it. And now we've seen it in a wide variety of other ways. And just this repeated reminder that we don't matter, that, we're designed to think egotistically or whatever, but really to zoom out to that systemic perspective is powerful.
Well, so I would qualify just to for clarity for your listeners, I would qualify that a little bit in that I do think we matter. And I just don't think we matter in the way we thought we did. One of the, like I said, we are, for better or worse, the primary sapient species within our, within the larger neighborhood here. The whole idea of the Anthropocene, of a geologic era that has been a terraforming scale transformation of the planet in the image of the culture of one species, we're incredibly important. We just, again, don't, in a certain sense, don't recognize the ways in which we are important, partially because we operate under sort of illusions of where we fit into the larger scheme of things. And so I think part of the paradox of this is that through the Copernican turn, we understand that we are in fact in a way that the world does not operate around us in this cosmological sense. The implications of that is that we actually have a greater responsibility for the subsequent composition of the world, because we are the medium through which, in essence, the world figures itself out.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I like that pushback on both the paradoxical nature here. And I was going to bring up the example of climate change, which shows that
Yeah.
the things are so much bigger than us, and also we're obviously affecting the Earth system. And so, yeah, keeping that paradox in mind is helpful for listeners, and also this reminder to listeners that even if there's this nihilistic thought of having that we don't mean very much in the macro universal sense, that this individual, there's this great video from Kyrgyzstan called Egoistic Nihilism, which is about how, we can actually, just even though things might be nihilistic, like living a fun life is still good. So trying to balance those two. So I do want to transition now, though, Ben, to this idea of, getting into some of the specifics for, we know that the Industrial Revolution had the rise of positivism and Marxism, all these things, and now we're seeing, this digital revolution. And how, for you, what are some of the specifics in thinking about the stack and your work with Terraforming and the Strelka Institute? How are you understanding the world?
Well, let me maybe explain, sort of rehearse a little bit the thesis of the book. Might be a entry point to this way. So, and it's a rather big book. It's 500 pages or so. There's single diagram, I guess, structure. So you could say it's sort of one diagram with a 500-page caption is the structure of this. And the book on software, in the subtitle of Software and Sovereignty, it speaks to this phenomenon of what I've called planetary-scale computation. And so, first of all, instead of thinking of computation as in a very abstract sense, in the way in which theory of computation we teach in computer science departments, or instead of thinking of computation as a kind of object in the world, like that's a computer, but that other thing is not a computer. Instead, what we're looking at is to understand computation as a planetary scale infrastructural phenomenon, which includes the types of things we would normally think of as the internet, but it also includes much more besides. It's an identification of this construction, again, of what I call this sort of accidental megastructure of planetary scale computation that includes terrestrial, oceanic, urban technologies, sensor mechanisms, all the rest of this. And the argument that the book makes is essentially twofold. One is that planetary scale computation both distorts and deforms traditional Westphalian models of political geography. And by Westphalian, I mean like the bounded secular, geographically, territorially bounded secular nation state, and produces new territories in its own image. And so we're already in the process by which the maps are being redrawn in relationship to the affordances of this new infrastructure. And second, it argues that instead of thinking about all of the different kinds of species or genres of planetary scale computation, smart grids, cloud computing, smart cities, Internet of Things, AI, augmented reality, as a bunch of different sort of species all spinning out on their own, we can instead actually think about them fitting together in a way that is not unlike network architecture stack of OSI as OSI or TCP/IP as an example, in which there are layers of this composite that are defined by their particular functions. It's possible, in other words, to think about planetary scale computation as a kind of model, at least in the model sense, as a kind of totality. And when we think of it as a totality, it allows us to understand patterns and structures within the whole that might have been obscure if we were focusing on too myopically on particular moments or on particular places. And like any kind of model, when you have that sort of a totality, it also allows you to recursively act back upon the system. And so a lot of what the book is both a kind of an explication of how we got here, what the history of the system is, what the history of the system is in relationship to the history of political geography itself, going back to the early modern era, a description of how these 6 layers work. And for the book, the model is that there's an earth layer, a cloud layer, a city layer, address layer, interface layer, and user layer, where we sit. And so the book lays out describing the reality of each of these layers. And then the third part is a proposition for what may be to come, because part of the way in which stack systems work, and I mean like hardware, software stacks, is they're designed to be replaced. That the way in which whatever occupies functionally at any one particular layer, a layer is defined by the function of the layer, not by the qualities of whatever occupies it. That it's modular. It's designed that layer 3 can be replaced by something else, and the whole system still works. Layer 2 and layer 6 can be replaced, and the whole system still works. And so, the stack that we have, in other words, is not the stack we will have in the future. The stack to come, the design of the stack to come, the composition of the stack to come, the conceptualization of the stack to come is the project. It's the design project. It's the political project. It's the economic project. It's the philosophical project that we have in front of us for the coming decades.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of repeat some of that back for our listeners and reflectively listen. I love that explanation. I think the first thing you noted is this idea of planetary scale computation, which is this accidental megastructure. And I love thinking of this as, kind of, we've completely changed how information is propagated in the world. And it used to take a lot more time to do that. And now that we have this crazy big megastructure, it completely changes our nation state systems. And so thinking about that, it's like we have the Industrial Revolution. We can think of our nation states as we know them today, the Westphalian geography, as a part of and a result of and co-evolved with the Industrial Revolution. And now, as you note, once we have, TikTok, but also the internet and all these important things, the geographical structures that we have today, the Westphalian politics, are going to change. And we're already seeing that breakdown in a wide variety of ways. So totally agree with that.
Right. But let me sort of anticipate where we might go with this is that, because you mentioned TikTok, which we're all following the headlines every morning about all the different kinds of ways in which it seems the opposite is happening. It seems that, wait a minute, it's not that states are going away; it's that states are actually fortifying themselves through the nationalization of and the exclusive nationalization of technologies, apps that aren't available in China or only available in the US or vice versa, GDPR, Europe becoming this kind of Galapagos data jurisdiction. The important point I want to sort of emphasize, and because part is that this is one of the ways in which there's, I think, bit of perhaps I should have, in terms of an interpretation of the book, is that the argument is that the cloud layer and cloud platforms in general are taking on more and more functions, traditional functions of the modern nation state: legal identity, currency, cartography, and so on. But at the same time, states are taking on more and more of the technical capacities of cloud platforms. So as cloud platforms, in essence, evolve towards something in which they function as kind of state scale, stateless actors, or at least have the capacity to do so. At the same time, states are evolving, as I say, into state platform. The cloud allows states to see things, to process things, to structure knowledge about the world and about their populations that were impossible to do before. And so the phenomenon that I identify with this was called hemispherical stacks. That, for example, the split between the Western, so it's not like there's one stack that operates the entire world, but rather you can imagine it's a kind of mitosis by which was the stack genera is splitting into essentially a Chinese-centric stack, an American-centric stack. Europe is a little bit different. Russia has its own kind of structure here as well. And that and this is the important point, the split towards a multipolar geopolitics, a multipolar hemispherical geopolitics, and the split of the stacks towards these multipolar, sometimes technically exclusive and antagonistic relationships are the same phenomenon. It's not that the politics is causing the technology to split or the technology is causing the geopolitics to split. They are in fact the same thing. That our geopolitics and our geotechnologies are so bound together that we can't really think of one without the other. And that's where what I mean when I say that it is producing new geographies in its own image.
Yeah, I like that. I think it makes me think of two things. A, this concept of new institutional economics and institutional coevolution, where we saw the rise of, and there have been some articles about this around like, oh, okay, Wikipedia as a new kind of institution, like a new open source institution is really interesting. And we are now seeing just institutional coevolution in general, which is like, yeah, nation states are quote unquote battling with and co-evolving with these tech platforms. And it's not just like tech platforms versus the state. As you note, it's like the state is kind of sucking in parts of traditional platforms into them, maybe like surveillance, authoritarianism kind of stuff. And then also or on the vice versa, something like in Taiwan, these like beautiful, like, civil society stuff. And you can see the vice versa, which is platforms kind of sucking things that the state normally did, aka identity and stuff like that, into them. And so there's this battle between the states and the platforms here, which is going to be fascinating as it evolves. Yep. The other thing I wanted to note here was, just thinking about the geopolitics and the tech side. I think that there's just and again, that we can make these patterns with any kind of technologies in the past, but thinking about like nuclear security and like the Cold War, and like that was obviously nukes co-evolved with the USSR versus the United States. And so we're going to see more and more of that going forward. I want to ask a specific question here though, which is, and I really like what you said about these protocol layers.
I mean, the arms race connotations of this. Yeah, yes, for sure. I mean, just to underscore your point is that as part of the geopolitics of this is that, the history of technology's relationship to military strategy is so tightly bound. We have no reason to think that would ever be otherwise. And as the question of the planetarity moves not just from the terrestrial but up into space, I don't see any reason why that dynamic wouldn't continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the arms race was happening with respect to attention on the internet, aka Facebook and YouTube battling for the same eyeballs, and it is also happening with respect to the nation-state surveillance authoritarianism vibe as well. One thing that I love about the layers here in the stack is there's as you noted, there's kind of the micro layer at the bottom, the kind of user layer, and then it goes to the interface layer, address, city, cloud, and then Earth. And I think one that is really interesting is this like user kind of interface layer. Tell me how you think about that interface or that API between us as humans and the stack above us.
Sure. So just the way in which the model is it's a minor point, but the way in which the model is drawn, I usually have the Earth layer at the bottom and the user layer at the top because it's fine. Because and part of the argument there is also just to conceptually make clear that this whole system is dependent upon the foundation of the energy that drives this whole thing. We've learned from kind of 90s discourse that the digital was virtual as the analog was real. Computation is a deeply physical phenomenon. It is, and the stack is a hungry infrastructure. Its energy appetite, its mineral appetite is enormous. And we can't think of it as somehow virtual or immaterial. It's a foundational structure. So, and that was part of the logic of this. Now, to your question with the user and the interface, which I think you're right, it's a sort of a fascinating moment of contact here. So first of all, I should say that the user, as we define it, is a position. It's a position within a system, and it's a position that within the stack could be occupied by a person, as you say, but it could also be occupied by an AI. It could be occupied by a robot. It could be occupied by a human and an AI working together. It could be occupied by a human, AI, and two robots working together. It's a position that and you or I step into or out of many times over the course of the day. But the fact that we've developed this infrastructure that works just as well, that as far as the rest of the stack is concerned, a user is whoever or whatever is able to interact with the interface layer in order to send and receive command or information up and down the rest of the stack. So that could be an animal, vegetable, or mineral. It's agnostic in this regard. And in terms of the implications of that for the future of AI and automation more generally, there's obviously much to say. Now, the interface layer, as we define it, is in essence the way in which the rest of the stack represents itself to a user, so that that user can have some sense of what the possibilities for action are, so that it would choose one of these possibilities and act back upon it. And so you just think about the interface on your computer screen. The processor in your computer is capable of doing so many things, but it's too complex. There's too many things it could possibly do. And so the interface produces this kind of diagrammatic fiction, skeuomorphic diagrammatic fiction of certain things that you might want to do with it, and presents us with pictures that we take to resemble the actions we would like to take. So a trash can involves file deletion and so forth. But first of all, in that there's necessarily a kind of ideological and cognitive reduction of the space of positionalities within that interface itself. And that introduces all kinds of interesting complexities in terms of the way in which certain kinds of interfaces actually structure what it is that we understand is possible to do with the system itself. And my Linux friends and made this point for a very long time. Neil Stephenson, of course, wrote this book about the superiority of the command line. But there's another dynamic here in that the interface allows for there's a kind of translatability of what planetary scale computation is capable of, where it translates those affordances into something that we, the simple Homo sapiens, are able to understand in terms of our symbolic reasoning. And this allows more of us to participate in it. And so you have all these kinds of network law effects where the simpler the interface or the more intuitive the interface, the greater the network effects of the engagement there as well. But as the interface, one of the things that I talk about in the book in terms of a sort of area of concern here, let's say, is in relationship to augmented reality in the interface. And, I'm very interested in AR. I think it's wonderful. At the same time, I think there's a difference between, my suspicion is that there's a difference between the way in which we would cognitively, like neurologically process interfacial information that is on a screen. We process that as if it is a kind of artifact rather than a real event in front of us. But when we're walking around the world and the things that we see in the world are literally subtitled or narrativized or augmented for us in the moment of direct perception, I think it will be harder to make the distinction between what is an interface and what is real. And I think in the long term, the capacities for more manipulative forms of cognitive fundamentalism and platform lock-in will become even greater. But much to say on this. So
yeah, no, I think a couple pieces there. At the start, you talked about how, and I super agree with this, thinking of the stack as kind of a being that is hungry, I think is just a helpful, it's like one way that I like to view it is there's this, frontier of bits out there that we as humans want to explore and develop and exploit. And it's a hungry thing that we're going to keep on, it's like inevitable that we keep doing that. And then thinking about the specific interaction between that thing and us, this API between the things. Yeah, I love how you talk about how there's the stack, a bunch of bits needs to represent itself to us simpleton human types through, the floppy disk and those icons. And you can think of just how, when you're interacting with the world, this is just a constant reminder to listeners of like, hey, when Twitter went from 140 characters to 280 characters, that changed the interface and it changed the kinds of conversations that we could have on the internet. And so I think thinking about this desire for the simpler interface and the less friction, and then like maybe pushing against that or seeing that there's other spaces that we can explore there. And then the third piece that you talk about here, which I think is powerful and dangerous, is how AR is going to combine the symbolic and the real, in that it is, if we walk through the
Exactly.
world today, we see, okay, blah blah blah, there's a person over there, and he or she is an African American or an Asian or whatever, and or a white person, and then but those are your kind of own internal processes happening, symbols that you're applying. And if you then imagine that, no, those symbols that are applying to your mind are put on there by someone else, and that those things are saying, that is a bad person, or that is a good person, that is going to be ripe for some difficulties. I do want to keep talking about how the stack. I want to move from the stack right now to kind of your work today with the Strelka Institute and the kind of terraforming program that you have. So maybe it would be good to kind of talk about that program, and then the kind of goals of that program. Tell me about that.
Sure. No, happy to. Thank you. So the Terraforming is the name of a think tank that I direct at the Strelka Institute in Moscow. I've been the program director at this institute for 4 years. It's an independent nonprofit educational institute looking at future of cities more generally. The think tank meets for sort of a very, very intensive residency of 5 months. We just finished the first year of this, and we are in the process of looking at applications for the second year. It's extremely interdisciplinary. Our faculty are drawn from political science, architecture, design, anthropology, philosophy. A lot of the really interesting research labs within the big platforms. The notion of the terraforming that we're working with here, that we're sort of proposing here, is not terraforming of Mars or terraforming of the moon. It's based like this idea that with the Anthropocene, we have in essence terraformed the Earth, but have done so through this kind of headless, pilotless, basic, in many ways catastrophic kind of recklessness. The terraforming that we're talking about is the idea that is not to make the moon viable for Earth-like life. It's that in order to ensure that Earth remains viable for Earth-like life, the response to anthropogenic climate change is going to have to be equally anthropogenic. We are going to, whether we want to or not, we are going to have to fundamentally transform how it is that as a population of 7 billion primates, that we occupy the surface of the planet, that we draw energy from it, that we feed ourselves from it, that we house ourselves in it one way or another. It to be a geoengineering scale initiative that is not just about transforming clouds or transforming solar radiation or something, but indeed about how it is that a more deliberate process by which we compose how it is that we occupy this towards what we call a viable planetarity. And there's a number of different sort of, that being said, there's a few rather more specific ways in which we come at that problem that I think make our program unique. One is, as I've already indicated, that there's a kind of leaning into the artificiality of this, of understanding that the interrelationship between technical systems and ecological systems is permanent. And that the distinctions between them are themselves largely fictitious. And so that the artificiality of this transformation is something that we embrace. Second, it's an idea in terms of the geopolitics of this, is we're also looking at ways in which, we tend to think of these kinds of big scale transformations as first we need to change our way of thinking, then we need to change our politics, and that the politics will then make available certain kinds of technologies that will have a material and direct effect on the problem. We're allowing for looking at this the other way around by sort of looking at the history of technology in such a way that in many cases, the appearance of technologies has transformed the geopolitics in its image. And so for us, the relationship between the geotechnologies that we need and the geopolitics that we need, we tie these together very, very, very closely. And maybe the third one is in relationship where the stack comes in here is we recognize that when we're talking about questions like what is the impact that planetary scale computation, what is the positive impact that planetary scale computation could have on on that initiative, could have on the response to the Anthropocene or the mitigation of the most catastrophic effects of climate change and the transformation of a geopolitics and a geoeconomics towards a more stable and equitable arrangement. We first realized is that the very idea of climate change, not the scientific fact of it, but the concept of climate change, quote unquote, is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. That it is because we have this massive sensing and modeling and calculation and simulation infrastructure, we are able to produce this simple statistical pattern that demonstrates that this concept of climate change is possible, which implies to me a few things. One is that one of the things in terms of the sort of the philosophical changes here, one of the philosophical and conceptual changes that planetary scale computation brings with it is a conception of planetarity as such, a conception of an ability to conceive and model and represent a planet at once in ways that are significant and meaningful and important. In this way, and the other is that it demands in a way in which mechanisms in which it's possible to sort of again to recursively act back upon that and to structure our response to this in ways that not only the situation not only allows for but in fact demands.
Yeah,
and so. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I think I mean, so and we'll reemphasize this at the end, but yeah, it's a program in Moscow that is you've been running for almost 5 years, and that there's this like residency piece to it as well. This terraforming piece, which brings together a bunch of interdisciplinary folks to work on these problems of terraforming our Earth in a geopolitical, geotechnical image. And I think I really like what you're saying, and I was going to emphasize this earlier, but I think. Thinking of the way that I kind of reflect what you're saying here is that I like to think of our future as the co-evolution between like nature 1.0, aka the Earth, aka this amazing epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. So there's nature 1.0, then there's nature 2.0, aka all the humans, the networked human organism, and then there's nature 3.0, which is this networked, AI and computation piece. And so those three things kind of co-evolve with each other in a powerful and interesting way. Do you think one question I have about the program is like, I guess, do you want to give me like a specific for how you're thinking that geotechnology affects geopolitics?
Sure. So a couple of the things that we were looking at in the first year, we did a lot of interesting research and kind of speculative design and films around this. Two themes that speak to this. One is around space law. Space law is an increasingly really interesting area of legal thought and thinking, both because there's so much interest and attention and indeed money going into space exploration once again, and so that the questions around this are seemingly coming to the fore. But the way we're looking at it is also thinking about that part of the problem, for example, with the issue that we face in terms of climate change models, for example, that we have planetary scale computation that's produced these enormously confident models of the dynamics of very, very complex systems. We are not able to act upon the implications of those models. That the models is merely a representation of a circumstance, but unlike the way, say, the models of the market work, where the models of the market actually kind of bend back and structure the market activity in the first place, our models of ecosystems don't have that capacity to do so. And in what political scientists pointed this, and they call this a problem of global governance, that we have phenomena that are taking place at one scale, but our governing systems that are able to that would be able to act upon them are operating at a very different scale, and this mismatch causes all kinds of noise in the system. Space law is an interesting thing in that it's a precedent body of work. It's a body of precedents. It's a jurisdictional logic that takes on the adjudication of an entire planet as a whole. It's oftentimes used, as you know, to talk about mineral rights on the moon or Mars, or who has rights to do what in low Earth orbit, and so forth and so on. But thinking about it, thinking about the way in which planetary scale computation, one of the things that it produces is the capacity and conceptualization of planetary systems as a whole. Thinking about the legal structures, the ways in which the implications of those models could enforce themselves. Space law is one of the areas we're very, very interested in here as well. Here is a clear example then of we have the development of a geotechnological system that produces phenomenon, that produces things that need to be accounted for politically, and then demands a transformation or produces or necessitates a transformation in the political institutionality in order to account for the reality. Another one that we looked at in relationship to this kind of, as Epidemic you asked for, is how is it that the geotechnology can produce the geopolitics, has to do with some of the work we're doing around negative emissions technologies. Negative emissions technologies, or NET, is sort of a general term to describe any kinds of technologies that are the function of which is in essence to absorb atmospheric carbon and CO2 in a way that at a scale that is climate significant. There's several recent IPCC special reports that indicate that even the least ambitious of the warming targets are unlikely to be realized only with cuts to new carbon emissions. That there is going to have to be at the same time also a climate significant scale subtraction of already existing carbon and CO2 that is in the atmosphere. There are any number of technologies that can demonstrate this in the lab, but understanding how to do this at the scale that is needed is more a political and economic problem. And so one of the projects that we did called To Bury the Sky was looking at the specific potential of Siberia, particularly the subterranean basalt in Siberia as a likely area in which you could actually do this carbon sequestration at an enormous scale, and that's really what is necessary. What is necessary to do that, and so this research not only sort of worked out ways in which you could power this, ways in which you could structure this as well, but also quite a bit of work on the economics and the politics of the whole thing.
Great, got it. Yeah, I think those are two good examples. That space law. I mean, obviously, back 10,000 years ago, we weren't thinking too much about space law, but now that we can actually go into space, and now it's a frontier, and you say, who should get which pieces of land, and where should you land, quote unquote, and where should you be able to go on the asteroid or with satellite patterns, that then leads to that new technology and, macro planetary scale technology then leads to some of these interesting bits of space law and space institutions that we need to create now. And then similarly with the negative...
And just to clarify that, I think part of the implication here is that what it means is that we think of Earth as in space, right? It's not as though there's Earth where there's one law and over there's space. Is the space law? The Earth is in space, obviously, and so it is in fact part of this jurisdictional thing, and part of that legal shift of kind of the way in which our understanding of Earth, of our planet as an astronomic entity and its own positionality comes to take on something that actually has more political and legal significance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. I like thinking of, it's kind of, that it is actually, we are in physical, we think of physical space usually not as, space, but actually we can just extend the map a little bit further. So it includes out there. And then the second one of these negative emissions and how, we need to do negative emission stuff in order to not get, in order to help with the climate crisis, and how to do this at scale, and thinking about doing that in Siberia, and some of the economic and institutional changes that would need to happen if we wanted to really, quote unquote, bury the sky, as you said. So that is all fascinating. And I want to switch to one final thought here before we wrap up the show. And this final one is about COVID. We are currently in a global pandemic, and you wrote this great article called 18 Lessons of Quarantine Urbanism. This was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think I just want to do kind of a high level, I'll share the article with listeners. It's really it is these 18 lessons, and at least 9 of them are great. I mean, and seriously, that's like an amazing, and that's not a diss. That's like 9 of them are really good. And so give me your high level view on like how you're viewing COVID itself, or
Yeah.
how some of these
Okay.
lessons of
Sure.
quarantine
Thank you.
urbanism?
Yeah. Thank you. I should also say for your listeners is that I'm currently turning this article into a book called "The Revenge of the Real," which will be coming out from Verso next year, which you will be a little bit deeper dive into this as well. There's a few, obviously a few many things I talk about in there as well. Three that I think that dovetail nicely with what we've talked about here, is that one of the ways in which we can view this pandemic, or I think one of the ways in which, when we're looking towards a post-pandemic politics, that we will be looking back at the pandemic, is as this incredibly strange but also amazing experiment in comparative governance, in which the virus was the control variable, and different governing systems either dealt with it well or dealt with it very, very poorly. And there's clear patterns in terms of the kinds of political systems that we may want to encourage or discourage going forward based on the results here. It's clear that the governing systems that were very trusted, that were very technocratically competent, that already had a robust and inclusive and equitable sensing layer capacity within their medical system, generally that intervened early, generally did well. Populist governments did really, really poorly, and that one of the things that we may anticipate from this pandemic is that those wave of populist politics of the last few years may not survive this moment, whether it's Trump or Boris Johnson or Bolsonaro. That the idea, and if we define populism in this way as sort of an idea that the way in which that the kind of mythological narratives that a particular culture has about the way it works are somehow imagined to be ultimately more powerful than the underlying biochemical reality of the world itself. This lasts a little while, but ultimately this comes crashing down, and we're seeing it happen. We're seeing it happen all around us. Second, one of the things that I think that emerged with the pandemic that we will want to keep going is what I call the epidemiological view of society. And that is, as we all sort of found ourselves mid-pandemic, looking at our phones and watching lots of charts and keeping track of statistics about how close the wolf was to the door and what the future might look like, we all became amateur epidemiologists and trying to understand logics of contagion and there's dynamics here as well. And as masks became a more important part of what it meant to be part of society and what it meant to participate in society, this epidemiological conception of what a society was, it makes this possible. And that when I wear a mask and I go out into the world and I'm seeing other people, I'm imagining myself as this kind of biological object or entity that is contagious and could do harm, whether I mean to do harm or not. And as we begin to sort of understand ourselves as this, as a population whose biological proximity has importance and has effect beyond the symbolizations that we might have for it. This is an embrace of the real that will also do us good going forward. The third one, and this is the one that got the most, it was probably the most controversial, to be honest, was one in which I kind of made a bit of a pushback against the I think now more predominant anti-surveillance discourse. Shoshana Zuboff, surveillance capitalism, stuff like this, and we could talk about that more specifically. But what I was arguing here is that, in fact, I'm not arguing that surveillance is good. What I'm arguing is that the term has been overinflated, and it's used to describe too many things. That it's used to describe any way in which a society would want to sense itself, model itself, and act upon itself deliberately, to compose itself deliberately through the models that it produces based on that sensing, to call all of that surveillance, and therefore a form of pernicious social control, as a way of capturing otherwise free individuals into some kind of hard or soft totalitarian gesture. the pandemic demonstrated many sort of ways in which that just doesn't work. One of the things that climate science demonstrates is that there are other ways that we can produce planetary scale data-driven models of how the world works that are secular, that are useful, that are confident, that should be driving our politics. And the ways in which we've chosen to use planetary scale computation for advertising, for manipulating people into clicking on stupid things, is not the way we should be using planetary scale computation. We should be using planetary scale computation more like the way we use it for climate science, but using it as a way of that would allow societies to sense, model, and act upon themselves deliberately.
Yeah,
That I think is one of the foundational ideas for what post-pandemic politics should be about.
Great. Yeah. So I just want to reflect those for our listeners because there's a lot of juicy, good stuff there. The first is, the comparative governance piece and how the technocratic governance on one side versus, the populism, on the other side, and that the technocratic governance did better. If you can sense your population better, if you can do a little bit of, let's call it surveillance or whatever, and actually, make good actions with respect to science, then that obviously did a lot better versus, and as you note, there's this what's the term for us? Yeah, there's a simulacra here in the sense that there's like the narratives of Trump and Bolsonaro and those things. The narratives are powerful and they hit our emotions, but eventually those are just looping on themselves, and they eventually have to come in contact with reality. And when it comes in contact with their biochemical realities, oh wow, just saying the virus is going to go away doesn't actually make it go away. And so having thinking about those two different things is interesting. The second piece,
and the implications of that for climate change should be obvious.
Yes, that we can't just say XYZ about climate change. Like, we need to connect things back to our biochemical reality. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Reality bats last.
Yeah. Nice. I like that. Reality bats last. And the second piece is, I love this epidemiological view of society. And I just think it's part of a form of viewing, which is seeing like a state is a great way to view, like being able to see like an internet platform, or being able to see like one of these AI interfaces that we were talking about, being able to take the perspective of both yourself as an individual, but also as these kind of greater collectives is really powerful. And I really like what you said here about, it's a reminder of our own physicality and biophysical reality, that we are we're moving through the world and seeing ourselves as just kind of like this biological being connected to all these other biological beings. So it's, again, this connection back to the real. I also think that
seeing yourself as part of a population that you are inevitably entangled with, right? That it's not that you're an individual first and then secondarily you enter into this collective. It's like, no, you're actually part of this. You're part of this species population to start with. Like that is what you are.
100%, whether or not there's a pandemic. And I think that move towards, and we could talk more about this, but there's this creation of individualism within Western society and weird societies, and how that has been good in a variety of ways, but also we're seeing the negative manifestations of that as we fail to connect rights and duties and to see ourselves as part of a collective. And so I do think that this epidemiological view will help us see ourselves more in a networked and collectivist sense. And then this third piece that you say here, I super agree that it's just an emotive term here, where if you think of us collecting data about ourselves, that is the kind of positive sense of like what is true. And then you can normativize it and say like, oh, it's surveillance, ooh, evil. Or you can say, oh, this is actually just like a beautiful climate change model that's helping us understand how transportation works in our city or whatever. And so making sure, do you have like a proposal for a different word there that we wouldn't use instead of surveillance? Like, if it's not surveillance,
the sensing, I call it the sensing layer. It's basically just the way in which a society is able to sense what's going on within itself. But that would include, not just like super fancy chips from smart city infomercials. It would also include, having enough nurses that you can equitably and inclusively provide medical care to the entire population, so that those people can put a thermometer on someone and say, okay, this is a point where we need to care for someone. There's also this dichotomy between a high touch care, the provision of social care, versus a high tech. I don't believe in this dichotomy. I think you need both of these as well. So that sensing layer it would be my term.
Yep, great. That makes sense. I like that. And I think, yeah. So to conclude here, the whole podcast is we're going to get in wrap up mode. I think at the beginning we talked about the stack and kind of how you view society, which is in this like tech society loop thing where it's like, hey, we have this new technology. It's drastically changing how we view ourselves, and we can kind of positively shape that if we understand it. And so trying to understand it is a lot of your work. And The Stack is a great book that I recommend for readers. I've read it. It's quite good, especially if you're interested in just understanding an abstract perspective, how these kinds of systems co-evolve with each other and how computers co-evolve with humans. It's a good read. And then second, we talked about your current work with the Strelka Institute and these terraforming programs. And it's November 10th is when folks have to apply for this next one. And I'll add this to the show notes. But if you go to the Terraforming .strelka, that's STRELKA.com, then you can check that out, or just Google Ben and you'll find it. And so he's apply by November 10th if you're excited by thinking about how geotechnologies shape geopolitics and vice versa. And then finally we chat about quarantine urbanism here and COVID and some of the learnings. And I guess that there will be a book coming out about the real, how we need to be connected to
the revenge of the real. This is called The Revenge of the Real Post-Pandemic Politics. Yeah.
Exactly. Beautiful. Anything else you want to say there, Ben? Any place that people can find you on the internet?
Yeah, no, sure. I very much appreciate the chance to speak with your listeners and cover so much ground. I for those of you who might be a little also more interested in some of the work, the more applied work that we're doing through the terraforming program, that URL that Reese mentioned, the terraforming, all one word, .strelka, STRELKA.com, is also where you'll find a copy of a short book I wrote called The Terraforming, which is a kind of, it's about 30,000 words or so, but it's sort of, in a way, a kind of design brief or manifesto for this initiative. It's free to download. Go ahead and have at it. And look forward to being in touch with your listeners in the future.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you again for coming today, Ben, and hope all the listeners enjoy this episode. Goodbye, everybody. At the end of an episode, I like to give my own thoughts about that episode, and here are my thoughts. I have three main thoughts. The first is this idea of being a social theorist, and that Ben talks about tech being ahead of the concepts that we have of it. I think that's a brilliant way to talk about our current situation in society, which is that most of the time, our concepts and our models of reality are fit with reality itself. But during some intense periods of upheaval, agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, information revolution, the model that produced our reality is no longer the same model. Either our sensing changes what we can understand about ourselves, or this new technologies that we have just change ourselves and change the model so deeply that our models of reality have to change and our understandings have to change. And yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. And, for Ben, I think that this idea that, I think connecting it back to, as he says with the stack and our planetary-scale computation, that those things, and, and the internet, those disrupt Westphalian geography and create new geographies in its own image. And I think that hits the two crucial pieces here, which is that the internet is both changing our understanding, our current, old models, industrial age models of the nation state. And you can see that in small ways with something like how Facebook was part of the Arab Spring, or how surveillance is part of, Hong Kong's struggle for independence. And that our systems of, our nation state style systems are going to be continually rocked by these new digital technologies. And then on the other side, it's like, creating new geographies in its own image. A lot of those geographies we see just on the internet, like subreddits or QAnon conspiracy theorists or things like that. And there's also new geographies that show up in reality. And so this is when you have a, Bitcoin meetup group that meets at the local bar, or when you have, San Francisco as a entity kind of show up in this massive way. just like how, London or New York City showed up in the past. So I think that this idea that tech is ahead of our concepts is a crucial one. And I like the idea, and I think there's so much juicy space to explore. Just like, as Ben was saying in the show, Marxism and positivism and all these cool ideas showed up in the industrial age as a response to our industrial moment and the changes that wrought on society. So too is there so much, amazing untapped space for new kinds of social theory and models of our ability to understand ourselves in the information age. Okay, that's point one. Point two is, this differentiation that Ben gives between the surveillance layer and a sensing layer. And I really like this because we have this negative instinct towards surveillance, especially for me coming more from a cryptocurrency world. It's like surveillance is evil, whether it's surveillance authoritarianism from nation states or surveillance capitalism with companies. That's like bad, But actually, the act of trying to sense our reality, do sense making, do epistemology, doing that and then using that to, inform good decision making, that's a good idea. And I love the example of climate change as that, where it's like, hey, we actually like it when we surveil our current climate models. And we don't call that surveillance, we call it modeling. But they're the same thing. It's just whether you're, modeling and getting data and sensing the Earth, in biological, non-human biological systems, or whether it's human systems. And I think that there is and I do want to say, I love this line from Ben where he says, the concept of climate change itself is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary-scale computation. That's so true. Like, we have the fact that we can look and see all these models and look at Google Earth and see smoke models and all these things, that is a sign that we can surveil the Earth at this global level really well. And I do think there's this huge opportunity, though, for a new kind of surveillance that is not authoritarian and it's not, deeply capitalist or what have you, but it is instead adding to our societal sensing layers. And I don't know what the word for that is. Ben provided the word, a sensing layer, but I don't think that's good enough. There's, this word surveillance, which means, bottom-up surveillance, something like, the smartphones taking images and videos of the George Floyd killing. That's an example of our ability as society to kind of point all of our technological tools onto bad things and or good things and show, hey, these are happening, let's deal with them. And those are happening in this, more bottom-up way. And so I think there's some term here or some kind of movement that allows us to surveil ourselves, but in a delightful, in a powerful bottom-up way. So I think there's a lot of juiciness there. My final third point is kind of a meta point around how folks like Ben and other social theorists should interact with the builders of the world. And this is a more general question between academia and industry. And Ben exists at this intersection to some extent, but if we think about this idea that, hey, we should have this, the sensing layer, we shouldn't break things down into surveillance and say, that's evil. How do we actually build out something like that sensing layer? How does that go from an idea to, or a book or something like that, to being implemented or invested in by venture capitalists or funded by grants and civic technology? How do we take this architecture as design discipline idea and really push the building and design side? And I don't know the right answer to that. I think it's an information logistics problem, and I think that, I think that is obviously a juicy area of exploration as well. So that, I think this is a good episode. It's cool to hear Ben coming from very similar angles that I come at problems with, but for him, it's coming with a much more academic angle and an angle steeped in and architecture and philosophy and kind of more readings. So I think that that's powerful. Okay, have a good week. Goodbye.